The most dangerous love stories are not the ones that begin suddenly. They are the ones that have been waiting for years while you never even noticed. The morning I became Ethan Walker's wife, I stood alone in front of a floor-length mirror wondering how my life had somehow become a plot twist. The wedding dress fit perfectly. The pearl earrings had belonged to my grandmother. Fresh white roses filled every corner of the bridal suite. Everything looked exactly like the kind of wedding little girls dream about. Yet all I could think was one question. How did I end up here? My name is Olivia Carter. I am a third-grade teacher from Chicago. I spend my days helping 8-year-olds learn multiplication and reminding them not to eat glue. Nothing about my life had ever suggested I would marry one of the most successful chief executive officers in the country. Especially not this one. Ethan Walker was not some stranger I met at a glamorous event. He was my best friend's older brother. That fact alone should tell you how strange this story really is. Because if someone had shown me a photograph 10 years earlier and said I would one day wear his wedding ring, I would have laughed until I cried. The first knock came at the bridal suite door. Before I could answer, Sophia Walker burst inside carrying enough energy to power an entire city block. My best friend looked impossibly elegant in her bridesmaid dress. She immediately stopped and stared at me. Then her eyes filled with tears. "Do not start," I warned. "I worked too hard on this makeup." "You are getting married," she whispered dramatically. "I am aware." "To my brother." "Still aware." Sophia laughed and wrapped her arms around me. For a moment we simply stood there. Best friends. Future sisters-in-law. Two girls who had shared nearly every important moment of adulthood together. "You look happy," she said quietly. The answer should have been easy. Instead, I hesitated. Not because I doubted Ethan. Quite the opposite. Ethan was kind, thoughtful, reliable. The kind of man who remembered tiny details people forgot to mention. The kind of man who made difficult days feel easier simply by being present. He had never once given me a reason to question his intentions. Yet standing there with a wedding veil in my hands, I still struggled to understand how everything had happened so quickly. 2 years earlier, I had been attending Sophia's birthday party as usual. 1 year earlier, I had been sharing coffee with Ethan after a family gathering. 6 months earlier, he proposed beneath a skyline filled with winter lights. Now I was hours away from becoming his wife. Sometimes life moves so gradually that you never notice change happening. Then suddenly you look around and realize everything is different. Sophia studied me carefully. "You are thinking again." "I am always thinking." "That is your problem." I laughed. "Probably." She smiled but said nothing else. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if she almost told me the truth right then. Maybe she wanted to. Maybe she came close. But some secrets are too large to reveal casually while someone is putting on a wedding dress. An hour later, music echoed softly through the ceremony hall. Guests filled the rows of white chairs. Sunlight streamed through enormous windows overlooking Lake Michigan. I stood at the entrance gripping my bouquet while my heart attempted to break every known speed record. Then the doors opened, and there he was, Ethan Walker, waiting at the altar. Tall, calm, perfectly composed in a dark suit. The strange thing was not that he looked handsome. Everyone knew Ethan was handsome. The strange thing was the expression in his eyes when he looked at me. Relief. Pure relief. As though he had spent years waiting for this exact moment. At the time I thought it was simply love. Months later I would discover the truth was far bigger than that. Because while I believed our story had started recently, Ethan Walker knew something I did not. Our story had actually begun 10 years earlier. Some people enter your life like fireworks. Others become part of your story so quietly that you never realize they were there until years later. The first time I met Ethan Walker, I was 18 years old and completely unimpressed by him. That sounds terrible now, considering I eventually married the man. But it is the truth. Back then, Ethan was simply Sophia's older brother. Nothing more. Nothing less. I still remember the afternoon clearly. Sophia had invited me to her parents' house after our first semester of college. We spent most of the drive talking about professors, exams, and the dramatic downfall of a student organization neither of us actually belonged to. The Walker family home sat on a quiet street lined with old trees and perfectly maintained lawns. Even then, the house was beautiful. Large without being showy. elegant without feeling cold. I remember feeling slightly nervous as we walked toward the front door. Sophia had always treated me like family, but entering someone else's family space still felt different. "Relax," she said. "Nobody bites." Comforting. She laughed and pulled me inside. The house smelled like coffee and fresh bread. Music played somewhere in the background. Family photographs lined the hallway walls. Everything felt warm, lived in, real. That was my first surprise. I expected wealth to feel intimidating. Instead, it felt ordinary. Then I met Ethan. He appeared at the bottom of the staircase carrying a laptop and looking mildly distracted. He was 26 at the time, already building the company that would eventually make him famous, already working ridiculous hours according to Sophia, already balancing more responsibility than most people twice his age. I barely noticed any of that. My first impression was much simpler. Sophia's brother seemed serious, very serious. "Olivia," Sophia announced dramatically, "this is Ethan." He extended his hand. "Nice to meet you." "You too." That was it. No dramatic music. No instant connection. No life-changing moment. Just a polite introduction between two people whose futures were quietly colliding without either of them realizing it. Or at least without me realizing it. Looking back, there were details I completely missed. Small things. Ding moments. The kind that only become meaningful later. During dinner, Ethan remembered my name after hearing it once. When Sophia mentioned I wanted to become a teacher, he asked thoughtful questions instead of offering generic responses. At one point he even helped clear dishes despite being buried under work emails. Nothing extraordinary. Just kindness. The sort of behavior people rarely pay attention to because it feels normal. The afternoon passed quickly. Sophia and I spent hours laughing over old stories and making plans for winter break. Eventually evening arrived. I gathered my things and prepared to leave. As I headed toward the front door, I realized it had started raining. Not a light drizzle. Real Chicago rain. The kind that turns sidewalks into rivers. "Great," I muttered. Sophia looked outside. "You drove." Unfortunately. Before either of us could discuss alternatives, Ethan appeared beside us holding an umbrella. "I will walk you to your car." "You do not have to do that." "I know." The answer was simple. Matter of fact. 5 minutes later, we crossed the driveway beneath the umbrella while rain hammered against the pavement. Most of the walk happened in silence. Comfortable silence. The kind strangers occasionally share without effort. When we reached my car, Ethan handed me the umbrella. "You keep it." "I cannot." "You can." "What about you?" For the first time he smiled. Not a large smile. Just enough to soften his serious expression. "I live here." I laughed. Then I drove away and forgot about the umbrella almost immediately. What I did not know was that Ethan never forgot that afternoon. While I moved on with college classes, part-time jobs, and ordinary life, he remembered details I barely noticed. And years later, I would discover that the simple day I considered completely unremarkable had become something very different in his memory. At the time, I believed coincidence was responsible for most of the good things in my life. Looking back now, I am not so sure. After that first visit to the Walker family home, life continued exactly as expected. College classes, assignments, part-time jobs, late-night study sessions fueled by coffee and determination. Ethan rarely crossed my mind, not because he had done anything wrong. He simply belonged to a different part of my life. Sophia was my best friend. Ethan was Sophia's older brother. The categories felt clear. Permanent. Simple. Yet over the next several years, strange patterns began appearing. Small things. Easy things to dismiss. The kind of details nobody notices until much later. During my junior year of college, I nearly lost a scholarship I depended on. A paperwork issue created a delay that threatened my funding for the following semester. I remember sitting in the financial aid office feeling completely overwhelmed. Tuition deadlines approached. My savings account was nearly empty. For the first time, I genuinely considered taking a break from school. Then somehow everything resolved itself. The missing documents appeared. The approval process accelerated. The scholarship remained intact. Called it luck. Most people would have. A year later after graduation, finding a teaching position proved more difficult than I expected. Every district seemed flooded with applicants. Weeks passed, then months. Interviews came and went. Rejection emails accumulated. One afternoon, while helping Sophia organize decorations for a family gathering, I confessed my frustration. Maybe I picked the wrong career, I said. Sophia immediately shook her head. No chance. The school district seemed to disagree. She laughed. You are going to be an amazing teacher. That does not help if nobody hires me. A week later, an elementary school called unexpectedly. They had an opening. They wanted an interview. 3 days after that, I received an offer. Once again, I considered myself lucky. The school eventually became one of my favorite places in the world. The students challenged me, inspired me, exhausted me, sometimes all before lunch. Yet I loved every minute of it. Around that same time, Ethan's company began attracting national attention. Business magazines featured his success story. Interviews appeared online. Financial analysts discussed his growing influence. Every so often, Sophia would send me a link and say something dramatic like, "Look, my brother is pretending to be important again." I usually laughed and returned to grading papers. On the rare occasions Ethan attended family gatherings, our interactions remained friendly but limited. He asked about teaching. I asked about work. Then life moved on. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt significant. Yet one memory always stood out. Every single time I encountered a difficult moment, Ethan somehow seemed aware of it. Not in an intrusive way. Never inappropriate. Just observant. During my first year teaching, he mailed a box of classroom supplies after hearing schools often lacked resources. When my car broke down during a particularly brutal Chicago winter, Sophia somehow knew the exact mechanic to call. When I wanted to attend a professional education conference, but could not afford the registration fee, an anonymous sponsorship suddenly became available. At the time, these events felt disconnected. Random acts of kindness scattered across years. I never questioned them because there seemed nothing to question. Life occasionally helps people. Good things happen. End of story. Then one evening after my wedding, while unpacking gifts in our new home, I stumbled across an old family photograph. The image showed a backyard gathering from nearly 8 years earlier. Sophia stood in the center laughing. I stood nearby holding a paper plate. Several relatives filled the background. It looked completely ordinary. Until I noticed something strange. Ethan stood across the yard, looking directly at me. Not at the camera. Not at the crowd. At me. The realization lasted only a second before I dismissed it. Coincidence, I told myself. Just another coincidence. The problem was that by then, I had started noticing there were far too many coincidences whenever Ethan Walker happened to be involved. The photograph should have been meaningless. That was the frustrating part. People look at other people in photographs all the time. Yet once I noticed Ethan's expression, I could not stop thinking about it. The image remained on my mind for days. Not because it proved anything. It did not. But because it made me start looking at old memories differently. Marriage has a strange way of revealing details you previously ignored. Suddenly you have access to pieces of someone's life that never mattered before. Their habits, their routines, their preferences, their history. A few weeks after the wedding, I found myself spending an afternoon in Ethan's home office while waiting for him to finish a conference call. Rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. The room was quiet except for the distant sound of his voice behind a closed door. I sat on a leather chair reading through lesson plans for the upcoming school semester. At least that had been my intention. Instead, I kept getting distracted by the office itself. Everything reflected Ethan's personality. Organized, thoughtful, precise. Books lined the shelves. Family photographs occupied a corner cabinet. Awards and business recognitions appeared surprisingly limited for someone with his level of success. If anything, the room felt personal rather than impressive. My attention settled on a framed photograph sitting near the window. Sophia and I stood together during our college graduation. I smiled immediately. Then I frowned. Why was this picture here? Ethan had not attended the ceremony. At least I did not think he had. Curious, I stood and picked up the frame. On the back, a small date had been written in Ethan's handwriting. 8 years earlier. Strange. Before I could think further, the office door opened. Ethan stepped inside, loosening his tie. Sorry. That took longer than expected. I turned around holding the photograph. You kept this? His expression softened immediately. Of course. Why? The answer came without hesitation. Because it was important. Something about his tone made me pause. Not suspicious. Just thoughtful. Ethan walked over and glanced at the picture. Sophia was proud of you that day. She was there. I know. I waited for more explanation. None came. Instead, he smiled and asked about my lesson plans. The conversation shifted naturally. Yet the question lingered in my mind. Why had he kept a photograph from an event he barely attended? The following weekend brought another strange discovery. Ethan's parents hosted a family dinner. Halfway through dessert, Sophia disappeared upstairs searching for an old photo album she wanted to show me. 20 minutes later, she returned carrying 3 enormous albums and enough enthusiasm to terrify everyone in the room. Soon we were surrounded by years of family memories, childhood vacations, birthday parties, holiday gatherings, countless moments frozen in time. Then I noticed something odd. I appeared in far more photographs than I remembered. Not because I had attended every event. Because somehow Ethan always seemed to be nearby whenever I did. Different years. Different occasions. Different locations. Yet there he was. Across a room. Standing beside a group. Looking in my direction. That is weird, I said absent-mindedly. Sophia glanced over. What? Nothing. I almost showed her the pattern. Almost asked if she noticed it too. But before I could speak, Ethan entered the room carrying coffee. His gaze briefly landed on the album. Then on me. For a fraction of a second, something unreadable crossed his face. Not fear. Not concern. More like anticipation. As though he knew exactly what I had discovered and wondered how much longer it would take me to understand the rest. At that moment, I still believed I was collecting random clues. I had no idea that every answer I needed already existed. Hidden quietly in a place I had never thought to look. The answers were closer than I realized. That is often how secrets work. They hide in plain sight until one ordinary moment changes everything. 3 months after our wedding, Ethan left for a 2-day business conference in New York. Nothing unusual about that. His schedule often included travel. The unusual part came on the second afternoon when his assistant called. Mrs. Walker? Speaking. I apologize for bothering you. Mr. Walker needs a file from his home office before tomorrow morning's meeting. No problem. She explained exactly where to find it. A cabinet near the back wall. 3rd drawer. Blue folder. Simple instructions. 20 minutes later, I stood inside Ethan's office searching for the requested document. The blue folder appeared exactly where it should have been. Mission accomplished. At least that was the plan. Then something caught my attention. Behind the folder sat a small wooden box. Dark walnut. Carefully crafted. Unlocked. The box itself was not strange. People keep private items all the time. What stopped me was the label attached. To the inside lid. Olivia. My name. Written in Ethan's handwriting. I stared at it for several seconds. Confusion arrived first. Then curiosity. Then something deeper. Slowly I lifted the lid. Inside sat a collection of objects that made absolutely no sense. A faded movie ticket. A folded event program. Several photographs. A pressed flower. A handwritten note. For a moment, I honestly wondered whether I was looking at someone else's memories. Then I picked up the movie ticket. My breath caught immediately. It was from a charity fundraiser held almost 9 years earlier. I had attended with Sophia. The date was unmistakable. The location was unmistakable. I remembered the evening perfectly because it was the first formal event I had ever attended. Why would Ethan keep the ticket? My hands moved automatically toward the next item. A photograph. In the image, Sophia and I stood outside a university building after graduation. The same photograph I had seen framed in his office. On the back, another note appeared in Ethan's handwriting. She finally made it. She never stopped trying. I stared at the words. Then at the next photograph. Then another. Every image included me somehow. School events, family gatherings, holiday celebrations.
Ordinar i moments primers barel i rememberat.
Yet Ethan had preserved them all. Carefully, deliberately. My pulse accelerated. The pressed flower came from a spring festival during my senior year of college. I knew because I remembered wearing a yellow dress that day. The event program came from an educational conference I attended years before meeting Ethan socially. The deeper I looked, the stranger everything became. None of the items were romantic. None of them were dramatic. They were simply pieces of my life. Tiny fragments collected over nearly a decade. Then I found the note. Folded carefully. Worn at the edges from being handled repeatedly. I hesitated before opening it. Something told me this mattered. The handwriting was unmistakably Ethan's. The date at the top made my stomach tighten. It had been written nearly 10 years earlier. The message itself was short. Not a letter. More like a private thought. Olivia wants to become a teacher. The world needs more people like her. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. My hands trembled slightly. Not from fear. From disbelief. 10 years. The date kept echoing in my mind. 10 years. Ethan had written those words after our first meeting. Before my career. Before my graduation. Before everything. Footsteps sounded in the hallway outside the office. I quickly placed the note back into the box. My heart pounded against my ribs. For the first time since opening the lid, a realization began forming. Not complete. Not yet. But impossible to ignore. This was not a collection of random memories. This was a record. A timeline. Evidence of something much larger than I had ever imagined. And deep down, I already knew one terrifying truth. Whatever story Ethan Walker had been quietly carrying for all these years, I had only just opened the first page. Once you discover a secret exists, it becomes impossible to stop searching for the rest of it. For the next several hours, I tried to focus on normal life. I answered emails, graded assignments, prepared lesson plans for the following week. None of it worked. My thoughts kept returning to the wooden box, to the photographs, to the notes, to the impossible date written across that folded piece of paper. 10 years. The number felt unreal. That evening, Ethan called from New York. "How was your day?" he asked. Usually I loved hearing his voice. Felt familiar. Safe. This time, however, every word carried new weight. "Busy," I answered honestly. "You sound tired." "Maybe a little." Silence lingered briefly. Then Ethan laughed softly. "You always say that when something is bothering you." The observation hit harder than expected. Because he was right. He knew my habits, my expressions, my moods. Somehow he always had. The conversation continued normally after that. Work, travel, weather, future plans. Yet by the time we hung up, one realization had become unavoidable. The man I married knew far more about me than I knew about him. The next afternoon, I returned to the office. Not because I intended to invade Ethan's privacy. At least that is what I told myself. The truth was simpler. I needed answers. The wooden box remained exactly where I left it. This time I opened it more carefully, more respectfully. What I found changed everything. Beneath the photographs sat a collection of notebooks. Not journals exactly. More like personal reflections. Observation pages. Thoughts recorded over time. My pulse quickened as I opened the first one. The earliest entry dated back almost 10 years. Olivia visited today. Sophia's friend. She talked about becoming a teacher. I do not think she realizes how determined she sounds when she talks about helping people. I stared at the page, then turned to the next entry. Another mention of me. Then another. Then another. The notes spanned years. Family dinners. Holiday gatherings. Graduation milestones. Career achievements. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing obsessive. Just observations written by someone paying extraordinary attention. One entry made me stop completely. Olivia received her teaching position today. She looked happier than I have ever seen her. I wanted to tell her how proud I was, but it was not my moment. The sentence blurred slightly as emotion filled my eyes. Not because the words were dramatic. Because they were sincere. Every page carried the same quiet respect, the same admiration, the same patience. Then I discovered something else. Several pages referenced opportunities one remembered receiving throughout the years. Scholarships, professional conferences, career recommendations, small moments that helped shape my future. The details were subtle, but the connections became impossible to ignore. Ethan never took credit, never appeared publicly involved. Yet over and over, his influence quietly surfaced behind important turning points in my life. He had never controlled my decisions, never directed my path. Instead, he seemed to remove obstacles whenever he could, like someone standing behind a curtain, making sure the door remained open whenever I chose to walk through it. My chest tightened. Suddenly, countless memories rearranged themselves into a completely different story. The sponsorship for the educational conference. The recommendation letter that appeared at exactly the right moment. The networking opportunity that led to my favorite teaching position. One coincidence after another. Except they were not coincidences. They were choices. Ethan's choices. The final notebook contained the most recent entries. The handwriting looked more familiar, more confident. One page near the back immediately caught my attention. It had been written the night before our engagement. I knew because of the date. Tomorrow I am going to ask her. I have imagined this moment for years. If she says no, I will still be grateful she exists. If she says yes, every year of waiting will have been worth it. Tears filled my eyes before I reached the final sentence. The truth stood fully revealed now. Not suspicion. Not theory. Not possibility. Truth. Ethan Walker had loved me long before I ever considered loving him back. Long before our first coffee together. Long before our first date. Long before I noticed him standing in the background of old photographs. And as I closed the notebook with trembling hands, one question echoed louder than all the others. If Ethan had been carrying this secret for 10 years, who else already knew the story I was only now beginning to understand? The answer arrived sooner than expected. The next evening, Sophia invited me to dinner. Under normal circumstances, nothing about the invitation would have seemed unusual. We met regularly, shared meals, shared stories, shared nearly every important chapter of our lives. Yet this time everything felt different. Because I was carrying a secret she did not know I had discovered. Or at least I thought she did not know. The restaurant overlooked the Chicago River. Soft lights reflected across the water. Conversations drifted through the room. The atmosphere felt warm and familiar. I barely touched my food. Sophia noticed immediately. You are acting strange. I looked at her across the table. Can I ask you something? Her expression shifted. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Sure. I hesitated, then decided honesty was easier. How long have you known? For a moment, genuine confusion crossed her face. Then understanding arrived, followed by resignation. Sophia slowly set down her glass. You found the box. It was not a question. My heart skipped. You knew about it? She laughed softly. Olivia, I helped him build half of it. The restaurant seemed to disappear around me. What? Not the notes. Not the photographs. Those were all Ethan. She smiled faintly. But I definitely helped preserve some memories over the years.
Is her.
You knew he loved me? For 10 years. The number sounded completely different when someone else said it aloud. 10 years. An entire decade. Why did nobody tell me? Sophia's smile faded. Because Ethan never wanted anyone pressuring you. The answer came instantly. Without hesitation. Like she had explained it before. He knew how much your friendship meant to me. He knew how important your independence was. He never wanted you to feel manipulated. I looked away toward the river. Countless city lights shimmered across the dark water. Then why keep everything? Sophia's expression softened. Because he thought nobody would ever see it. The words settled heavily between us. There were years when he convinced himself you would never look at him that way. I blinked. Years. Olivia. She laughed quietly. You barely noticed him. The embarrassing truth of that statement made me groan. That bad. Worse. Despite everything, I found myself smiling. Sophia continued. Do you remember your college graduation? Yes. Ethan drove 3 hours to attend a meeting nearby, so he could stop by for 20 minutes and see you walk across that stage.
Is dit her?
Seriously? She nodded. Do you remember the educational conference that helped your career? The sponsorship? That was him. Another memory rearranged itself. Another coincidence disappeared. The scholarship issue? Sophia smiled. Him. The teaching recommendation? Him. My head spun. Not because Ethan had secretly controlled my life. The opposite. He had never taken control. He had simply helped whenever possible and then stepped back. Every opportunity remained my choice. Every achievement remained my work. He never asked for recognition. Never expected gratitude. Why? I whispered. Sophia looked genuinely surprised by the question. Because. He loved you. Simple. Direct. Obvious. Yet hearing it spoken aloud changed everything. You know what the funniest part is? She asked. I shook my head. For years, Ethan thought he was running out of time. What does that mean? Sophia laughed. He was terrified someone else would realize how amazing you are before he found the courage to tell you. Emotion tightened my chest. Not because the story was dramatic. Because it was real. Because every missing piece finally fit together. As dinner ended and we stepped outside beneath the city lights, one truth became impossible to ignore. Ethan Walker had not spent 10 years building a master plan to make me love him. He had spent 10 years quietly hoping that one day, I might finally see what had been standing in front of me all along. After my conversation with Sophia, I walked through downtown Chicago for nearly an hour without realizing where I was going. The city moved around me in a blur of lights, traffic, and distant conversations. People hurried toward restaurants. Couples laughed beneath glowing storefront signs. Life continued exactly as normal. Yet inside my head, 10 years of hidden truth kept rearranging every memory I had ever shared with Ethan. The strange part was that I did not feel angry. If anything, I felt overwhelmed. Because the more I thought about everything Sophia had revealed, the more impossible it became to view our story the same way. Every coincidence had transformed into intention. Every small act of kindness carried new meaning. Every moment I once considered ordinary suddenly felt connected to something much larger. By the time I reached home, Ethan had returned from New York. His car sat in the driveway. Warm light glowed through the living room windows. For several minutes, I remained outside staring at the house, gathering courage. Not because I feared him, because I feared what I might feel once I finally spoke the truth aloud. When I opened the front door, Ethan looked up immediately from the sofa. Relief appeared across his face. There you are. The simple words tightened something inside my chest. Long day? He asked. I nodded. Very. He stood and crossed the room. You seemed distracted. The irony almost made me laugh. Distracted. That was certainly one way to describe discovering your husband had quietly loved you for a decade. Can we talk? I asked. Ethan's expression softened instantly. Of course. We settled into the living room. Rain tapped gently against the windows. A lamp illuminated the room with warm golden light. Everything felt calm, safe, familiar, which somehow made this conversation even harder. For several seconds I simply looked at him. The man I thought I knew completely. The man who still carried secrets I was only beginning to understand. Finally I spoke. I found the box. Silence. Not shock. Not panic. Just silence. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. I figured you might. You knew I would eventually see it? Eventually. His voice remained calm. Honest. I never expected it to happen so soon. I studied him carefully. 10 years. For the first time all evening, emotion appeared visibly in his expression. Not embarrassment. Not regret. Something closer to vulnerability. Yes. The single word felt impossibly small compared to everything it contained. 10 years of waiting. Hoping. Watching. Caring. Why did you never tell me? Ethan leaned back slightly. Thinking. Choosing his words. Because loving someone does not mean they owe you anything. The answer hit me harder than anything Sophia had said. Ethan continued quietly. You had your own life. Your own dreams. Your own future. His gaze met mine. I never wanted my feelings to become a burden. Tears threatened unexpectedly. Not because his answer sounded romantic. Because it sounded true. The scholarships? I asked softly. The opportunities? He smiled faintly. You earned every one of them. But you helped. Sometimes. Why? He laughed quietly. Olivia. The way he said my name carried 10 years of affection. Because every time life gave me a chance to help you succeed, I wanted to take it. Emotion filled the room. Not dramatic emotion. Not the kind found in movies. Something quieter. More powerful. The kind built over years instead of moments. Suddenly the entire puzzle became clear. The master plan was never about forcing fate. It was never about controlling outcomes. It was never about manipulating choices. Ethan had not spent 10 years creating a path that led me to him. He had spent 10 years becoming the kind of man worthy of standing beside me if I ever chose him on my own. And in that moment, sitting across from the man who had loved me patiently for a decade, I realized the greatest secret of all. The story I thought was about his plan had actually always been about his patience. Some truths change how you see the future. Others change how you see the past. In the weeks after my conversation with Ethan, I found myself revisiting memories constantly. Family gatherings, graduation photographs, holiday dinners, coffee conversations. Small moments I once considered ordinary now carried entirely different meaning. The remarkable thing was not discovering that Ethan had loved me for 10 years. The remarkable thing was realizing how carefully he had protected that love from becoming a burden. He never demanded attention, never expected gratitude, never asked me to become someone different. He simply remained there. Consistent. Patient. Steady. One Saturday morning, several months later, Ethan and I attended a community event sponsored by his company. Families filled the park. Children ran between activity booths. Teachers gathered near educational exhibits. The atmosphere felt relaxed and joyful. Exactly the kind of event I loved. While Ethan spoke with local organizers, I wandered toward a reading area where volunteers distributed books to children. Watching excited students choose stories reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. A little girl holding a stack of books suddenly looked up at me. "Are you married to the tall man?" she asked. I laughed. "I am." She nodded thoughtfully. "He keeps looking over here." Instinctively, I turned around. Across the park, Ethan stood in conversation with several executives. Yet even from a distance, I caught him glancing in my direction. The moment our eyes met, he smiled. The same smile. The one I now understood far better than before. Warm. Familiar. Certain. The little girl grinned. "See." Then she ran off before I could respond. For some reason, that tiny interaction stayed with me all day. Later that evening, Ethan and I sat on our back porch watching the sunset fade beyond the Chicago skyline. The air felt cool, comfortable, peaceful. "Can I ask you something?" I said. Ethan looked over. "Always." I smiled. What would have happened if I never noticed? He seemed to understand immediately. The box. Everything. For a moment he considered the question. Nothing. I laughed softly. That is not an answer. It is the truth. He leaned back in his chair. I would have been happy knowing you were happy. The simplicity of the statement nearly broke my heart. Because I believed him completely. Even if we never ended up together? Even then. The sunset painted soft gold across the horizon. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally I shook my head. "You are impossible." Ethan laughed. "That seems unfair. You waited 10 years. Technically less than 10 by a few months." I rolled my eyes. "Only you would correct that detail." His laughter filled the evening air. Looking at him then, I realized something important. People often imagine great love stories begin with dramatic moments. Grand gestures. Perfect timing.
Instant certainty.
Ours was nothing like that. Ours began with patience. With quiet choices repeated over years. With one man believing in someone long before she believed in herself. The master plan I spent so much time trying to understand was never really a plan at all. It was devotion expressed through consistency, through kindness, through respect, through time. Years earlier, I thought Ethan Walker was simply my best friend's older brother. Later, I thought he was a successful chief executive officer who happened to fall in love with me. The truth was far more extraordinary. He had been choosing me long before I ever noticed him. Long before our first date. Long before our engagement. Long before I stood in a wedding dress wondering how my life had become such an unexpected story. And now, whenever I look at our wedding photograph, I no longer see a surprising ending. I see the final page of a chapter that started 10 years earlier. A chapter written quietly in photographs, notes, memories, and patience. Because sometimes the greatest love stories are not the ones that happen suddenly. They are the ones that have been waiting for you all along.